Assalamu alaikum and welcome to our 65th webinar as part of a series that we conduct fortnightly here at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. We try to keep abreast of the movements in academia and in the world regarding international relations and the larger Muslim world. Today, I am pleased to introduce esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. David Miller, who will be joining us to speak about the war on Gaza, how its outcomes will shape the future of the struggle. Like our previous webinars, we will give 15 to 20 minutes to our participants, both Dr. Miller and Dr. Sami Al-Arian. And then we will have a discussion on the topic at hand. Without further delay, I would like to first give the floor to Dr. David Miller. But before doing so, allow me to introduce him. Dr. Miller was Professor of Political Sociology at Bristol University in the UK. In October of 2021, he was removed for criticizing the role of Zionism in spreading Islamophobia and for identifying Zionist student groups. He waits the outcome of an employment tribunal case he took against the university in October last year. Today, he joins us as a senior research associate at our center at Istanbul's Sabahattin Zaim University. He is a journalist and investigative researcher. He has written for many prestigious outlets, including the Mayadeen, TRT, Electronic Intifada, Mint Press, and Grey Zone, as well as being a producer and resident expert on Palestine Declassified, the only weekly English language TV show on Palestine broadcast on Press TV. Dr. David Miller, I welcome you as a fellow and a colleague, and we look forward to sharing your contributions to our larger audience. Welcome. But before I begin, I also want to say that Dr. Sami Al-Arian, who is the director of the Institute, is also in this call, in this webinar, and he needs no further introduction. But Dr. Sami Al-Arian is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. He's an expert on American foreign policy and Middle Eastern affairs, and he has a number of writings, policy reports on this topic. I will keep that brief. But Dr. David Miller, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. So today I'm in London, where just this morning we hear news of an event happening in approximately 20 minutes. A guy called Levi Simon will be introducing himself and his exploits to a Jewish charity, a Jewish young person's charity, not far from where I'm currently sitting. Now, Levi Simon, as some of you will know, has been active on Instagram with his tourist guide feed to Israel. And what he's been doing in that feed, of course, has been to illustrate his genocidal activities in Gaza, including, really quite famously, rifling through the drawer of women's underwear in a house in Gaza, from which the occupants have been dispatched. The reason I mention that is because it's happening now, and because that's an indication of the way in which the genocide in Gaza has all sorts of implications outside of Gaza, which I would contend in my remarks are absolutely central to the way in which Zionism must be dismantled, both in occupied Palestine, but also in all those countries where the Zionist movement has a significant presence. And of course, mostly that is, I mean, it's 35 or 40 countries where there is a significant Zionist movement presence through organizationally, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there are many other countries where the Zionists have influence, and people are not necessarily aware of the presence of Zionist organizations or indeed of the influence. And the example I want to give towards the end of this will be the example of Turkey, where there is a not very well known Zionist presence, which it seems to me is in need of research, and there are similar examples in countless other countries as well. Let me just start then by talking a small bit about myself. I was sacked from my position of Professor of Political Sociology in June 21 because I had done research on what I termed the Zionist movement, a term which in social science literature is more or less missing from the literature. If you Google on any academic literature source, the Zionist movement comes up very, very little. There's been one, as far as I'm aware, in English, one book in all of history called the Zionist movement, and it was written by Zionists in 1945 by the head of the Zionist organization in the UK. But of course, there is a Zionist movement, and people sometimes think that the Zionist movement was something which created the settler colony in Palestine through the Zionist organization, which became the World Zionist Organization and all its affiliated organizations. But of course, those organizations continued after the creation of the State of Israel. So you have the Zionist entity that has its government, which of course is currently headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. But there is also, of course, the Zionist organizations which form the head of the Zionist movement. These are called, in Israel, there are 4 of these. These are called the national institutions. So you can tell the status that they have according to the Zionists themselves. And the national institutions are, first of all, the World Zionist Organization, as I've mentioned, which is the top of the snake, if you like. And around about the World Zionist Organization, there are 3 other organizations which have been crucial in the creation of the Zionist entity and the Nakba, and indeed in the continuing existence and prospective activities of the Zionist movement. And those are, of course, the Jewish National Fund, responsible for stealing Palestinian land, the Jewish Agency, responsible for recruiting settlers to occupy the stolen land, and then, of course, the Keren Hazod, or to use the term that's often used in English-speaking world, the Jewish Israel Appeal, which is the organization which raises the money to accomplish the theft and the recruitment. So these are the 4 national institutions, all based in the same building called National Institutions House in Jerusalem, in King David Street. And people in the West, certainly in the English-speaking world, are not familiar with the fact that there are these organizations and that they have affiliates and members in countries all over the world. Round about 40 countries have affiliates for each of the 4 institutions in their countries. In the UK, for example, there's an office for the Jewish Agency, but there is an affiliate for the Jewish National Fund, the land thief organization. It's called the JNF UK. There's an affiliate for Keren Hazod, which is called the United Jewish Israel Appeal. And of course, there is a Zionist Federation, which is the UK member of the World Zionist Organization, which itself has some 40 odd members of formerly Zionist organizations in the UK. Now, the reason I go on at some length about this fairly dry technical stuff is that it's actually important to understand the way in which the Zionist entity constructs itself and supports itself. So, of course, there are the questions which everyone is aware of the support for the Zionists of the Western powers, and in particular, of course, the US and the UK, but also, Germany, as we've seen in recent days, very important. And then, of course, the Gulf states, which are effectively supportive of the Zionists, including, in particular, of course, Saudi and the Emiratis, not only them, but in particular them. So, of course, there are states which support with political protection, with economic measures, and indeed, of course, most obviously with military support, with the weapons which, for example, Germany has currently said it will send to the Zionists to murder Palestinians in Gaza. But there is also organizational support for Zionism in all of the countries where there is a formal Zionist movement. And I'm saying there's 40 odd countries. So, for example, in the UK, the organizations here in the formal Zionist movement are engaged in creating support, creating financial support, and creating ideological support for what's happening in Gaza every day. Now, I mentioned something like 40 or 50 organizations which are in the formal Zionist movement in the UK. But if you look in detail at organizations which are pro-Israel, such as charities or other lobby groups, for example, some of which are not formally affiliated with the World Zionist Organization, if you add all of those organizations up, and I suppose people usually can't guess the number, but there are approximately, we haven't fully totaled this, but approximately 3,000 Zionist organizations in the UK. Now, all of them are devoted in one way or another, whether they're socialist Zionist or revisionist Zionist or pro-settler or whatever, are all devoted one way or another to providing ideological, political, and economic cover for the occupation of Palestine and indeed for the genocide in Gaza. So if we're talking about defeating Zionism and liberating Palestine, of course that has to be done in Palestine. And of course, the resistance is the cutting edge of that. But nevertheless, also, there is an important job of work to be done in the UK, the US, and everywhere else where there is an organized Zionist movement to dismantle Zionism. These are in the UK, 3,000 organizations which are devoted to the racist philosophy of Zionism, which is intrinsically, ineradicably racist and doesn't see Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims, and indeed even Christians, as fully human. So that I think is an important element of what people in the West and outside Palestine ought to be thinking about, because it's something which is very close to them and which they can practically do something about. Of course, the manifestation of that in the example I gave at the beginning, is the example of this IDF, Israel Occupation Forces officer, who is back in London, who is about to give a public speech celebrating his awful activities in Israel and, of course, in Palestine. Sorry, and of course, there are many of these. There are many French, German, British, and US citizens, and many others who have been fighting in Gaza and involved in the genocide there. And it's clear that there needs to be a legal process to hold these people to account. Now, in the UK, for example, there have been just yesterday an announcement of legal proceedings potentially being filed against British citizens who've been involved in Gaza or indeed in the rest of occupied Palestine. And I think that process will go on, and it's an important element of constraining what the Zionists can do. And of course, we see the International Court of Justice, the activities of the South Africans and the other countries, 20 or so or more countries, which are now supporting the invocation of the Genocide Convention. So I wanted to make that point at the beginning. Now, of course, just to say a few words about my understanding of what Zionism is. So Zionism is an ideology which and this is not controversial, it's an ideology which proposes that there should be a Jewish state in the territory of historic Palestine. Now, and of course, the only way to do that, to have what they call a Jewish state, is to either kill or to remove the native population, which of course they tried to do in 1948 with the forcible transfer and the killing of thousands, which is what they're now trying to do again in Gaza. They openly call it a second Nakba. And that is an indication, there's an indication, I suppose, with the attack on Gaza, that this is genocidal ideology. Now, some people, I see many people who have not been studying the Zionist movement for as long as I have, who say, well, I'm just shocked. I knew the Israelis were bad, but I'm shocked by the genocidal activities which are self-evidently happening in Gaza, the attacks on mosques and hospitals and civilians, and the endless number of babies and children dragged from rubble, lifeless or amputated. I mean, we know the stories that are happening. Everybody knows these. But of course, we know that Zionism has always been genocidal, and that's because it's a settler colonial ideology. And I come to this from a history of studying the conflict in the north of Ireland, where again there was a similar sort of situation, a settler colony, a British and Scottish Protestant settler colony in the north of Ireland, which systematically abused and oppressed the natives, the Catholic Irish. So that's how I see this as an almost exact parallel, actually, of what's happening in Palestine. So I wanted to give that broad context, and I wanted to give the examples of the Zionist movement, which I have given, and then to move on to another question, which is about the extent of the Zionist movement. So the organizations to which I'm referring as the Zionist movement, of which there are, say, 3,000 organizations in the UK, many more than that in the US, probably about the same in France. But there are also, of course, Zionist organizations in other countries where there's not a formal Zionist movement. Now, I think it's correct to say that there is no formal Zionist movement presence in Turkey. But there is, of course, there are, of course, Zionist organizations or groupings. Now, let me give you one example, and this is one. I was in Istanbul just the other day, and I've just come back, and because I was coming to Turkey, I thought I would investigate this a little bit. So I spent 5 minutes on Google investigating. So let me just give you one example as a way of showing that this is a question which is relevant to every country. Now, there's an organization which some of you may have come across, which was in the news recently after secret tunnels were found underneath its world headquarters in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, in New York. And there was a conflict with the New York Police Department, the NYPD, when a lorry was brought in to concrete up these illegally dug tunnels. And of course, there's a conflict about who dug the tunnels and what they were dug for. And there's all sorts of arguments about that. But the organization we're talking about, its world headquarters in Brooklyn, is called Chabad Lubavitch, named after Lubaviki, the village in what's in modern day Belarus, where they came from. And this is a Hasidic sect, one of many Hasidic sects, which is not formally Zionist, and indeed, which used to be formally, at least, anti-Zionist. It didn't believe in a Jewish state. And to this day, it's critical of the idea of a Jewish state. But nevertheless, it's strongly involved in settlement activities and is strongly opposed to giving even an inch of territory back to the Palestinians under any kind of peace deal. So although it's technically anti-Zionist, it's in practice ultra-Zionist. It believes that the Jews have the right to the whole of Greater Israel, regardless of what the Jewish state might or might not do, say, or think. And of course, Greater Israel means the current territory of historic Palestine, plus Jordan and most of Lebanon, and parts of Syria, parts of Egypt, and of course, parts of Iraq as well. So I wanted to talk about this organization. It's an organization which is of the Hasidic sect. It's the most outgoing and most geographically spread around the world. Most Hasidic sects are inward-looking, shun publicity, and are, of course, they might be involved in Zionist politics. Almost all of them are. But this is an organization which is it's kind of like Christian missionaries. It spreads around the world, and it has an office in Istanbul, the Chabad house there, and the chief Ashkenazi rabbi is from Chabad. Now, Chabad is an organization which is fundamentally an ultra-Zionist and indeed Jewish supremacist organization. And although it appears to be cuddly, nice, and to provide chicken soup for interested visitors, it believes that non-Jews have animal souls, and it's of course strongly involved in the settler movement, including in around Hebron, which is where it's had a presence since the 1880s. And in 1929, for example, when it was formally anti-Zionist, its anti-Zionism stretched to the effect of storing weapons for the Haganah, the Zionist terror force, and indeed supplying intelligence information on the Palestinians in the Hebron Al-Khalil area to be used against the Palestinians. And nowadays, of course, its rabbis are active in Gaza. Formerly IDF rabbis are from Chabad. They opened a Chabad house in Gaza in early December last year. They opened a synagogue in Gaza then as well. And this is an organization which is clearly an important part of the Zionist movement. It's engaged, according to the Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence organization, in most of the price tag revenge attacks on Palestinians, which Shin Bet monitor. So this is an organization which is present in Turkey and Istanbul and in many other countries, more than 100 countries. And so I wanted to just give you that example as an indication that actually almost every country in the world has a formal Zionist presence, and that is something which the Palestine Solidarity Movement would do well to attend to. I think that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. I want to give Dr. Sami Al-Arian a chance to also contribute to this discussion. Dr. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ovais, and thank you, David, for part of this panel. Let me start by describing the word that we had on October the 6th and how October the 7th has changed things around. Before the operation of October the 7th, before Hamas and then other resistance movements got into this fight, we have to understand that the struggle did not start on October the 7th. Many Zionists and Israelis would like you to think that somehow the word was good and dandy, and that somehow the Palestinians breached some kinds of a peaceful word that existed prior to October the 7th, and that's why hell broke loose. But the fact of the matter is that the Palestinians have been under occupation for over 75 years. This conflict, as David pointed out, started, even long before 1948. That what the Zionists have been trying to do was to basically bring as many Jews as possible into the land of Palestine and then declare a state. This happened primarily under the British mandate between 1918 and 1948. For 3 decades, the population has increased tremendously. But on the eve of the creation of that state, we had about roughly a third of the population was Jews and 2/3 were Arabs. And most of these people who came under the auspices of the British illegal immigration. Nevertheless, so we had a state that was declared on almost 78% of Palestinian land. And then 1967, they had another invasion, another military invasion and occupation in which they took the whole of Palestine and a few other places like the Golan Heights. And throughout the years, Palestinians have been living under this two-tier system, one system for Israelis and one system for people under occupation. There have been a lot of attempts to reach a political settlement. That political settlement has failed miserably. It culminated into what is called the Oslo Accords, where the historical leadership of the Palestinian people within an organization, the Palestine Liberation Organization, they did the ultimate concession, which is to recognize Israel on 78%, in the hopes that somehow they will get a state on the remaining 22%. And of course, there was never a recognition by any Israeli leadership, left, right, or center, of any kind of acknowledgement of any Palestinian rights, whether Palestinian to a state, to territories, or even to political or legal rights. They've always been under occupation. This process was just a total waste of time. The United States was never an honest broker. It was a dishonest broker that always supported Israeli desires to colonize the land, and that's what happened. In 1993, we had approximately 125,000 settlers on the West Bank. Primarily, they came after the 1967 war, and today we have close to 750, perhaps even more, thousand settlers on this piece of land. Now, the Israeli right, which took control of most of the last 30 years in terms of being the governing authorities, they never recognized Palestinians or tried to give them anything. In fact, we right now have, since the beginning of 2023, the most right-wing government, basically a fascist government in the history of the Zionist state, in which basically they were trying to end this conflict by giving the Palestinians 3 choices. One is that they can acknowledge and recognize that this is a totally Jewish state with Jewish supremacist mentality, as David pointed out, which is the core of the Zionist ideology and Zionist movement. Or if they don't recognize that or don't agree with that, and to live under these conditions, then they can be compensated and leave, or the alternative, they could be killed. So there has been 2023, prior to the October 7th, really an accelerated movement towards trying to impose these realities on the ground. So what we had seen was many things taking place, not only in the West, across the West Bank, but also in Jerusalem and particularly Al-Aqsa compound. So the reason that we had the October 7th operation, I can probably give you 5 reasons of what this happened. Also in the context, before I enumerate these reasons, in the context of the geopolitical realities across the Middle East, we had between roughly the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990-91 and the beginning of the Trump administration in 2017, we had a unipolar moment in which the United States was basically the sole superpower across the globe. So it could do a lot of things. It can make mistakes and really get away with it. They tried their lot with going across the Middle East with social engineering, invading Afghanistan, Iraq, and they were hoping to do that to a number of other countries. Of course, they failed miserably, but they could do that because there wasn't really a superpower or a great power that is willing to challenge them. But of course, with the rise of China in the last few years, the United States had to really pivot, as the Obama administration would call it, and try to concentrate and focus on how to contain China, since this is going to be a huge challenge to the primacy and the hegemony of the United States. And to do that, they have to look at other regions and try to have a less footprint and try to, again, have less military presence and try to concentrate on how to contain China. And their choice for the past few years was to see, because this region, the Middle East and the Gulf area, is very important because of oil and other considerations, is to basically give the task of securing American interests to its allies, particularly Israel and Saudi Arabia. So they started a very fast-paced normalization process. During Trump, they were able to get United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco. They had discussions and other agreements with Sudan and Mauritania. But eventually, the jewel of the crown would have been Saudi Arabia, and that's what they were working on. There was really no difference between the Trump and the Biden administration on that point. So they tried to bypass the Palestinian issue once again, and they were trying to engineer a normalization pact between Saudi Arabia and Israel this spring. And while this was taking place, the Saudis actually gave up on all their demands of having any kind of a political settlement. They were
Dr. Sami, your mic went out.
okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Where did I miss? Okay, let me repeat the last point. I was trying to say that with this realization of having a new order in the Middle East, by which the U.S. will have less footprint, less military presence, and try to give the task of preserving or securing American vital interests in the area to its allies, particularly Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that would have meant that both would have to be in the same camp with a normalization that would have taken place this spring. So this is the geopolitical context by which, and of course, with that would be bypassing the Palestinian issue. So this is the geopolitical context by which it was very important to change the political calculus so that the Palestinians would not be bypassed. Another reason, of course, is because of this right-wing fascist government, there has been almost daily and sometimes even more incursions on Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa compound in Jerusalem. And the Ben Gvir people and Smotrich and all these extremist settlers, they were trying to impose new realities, what they called the new division in time and space. They wanted the Jewish settler community to be able to go to Al-Aqsa as they wish at certain times, and to have some kind of a legal right for them to do that, and try to get not only a time but also a place, because they were dreaming that somehow that they will be able to eventually secure that compound for whatever religious purposes they were planning to have. And of course, there was always a conflict with the Palestinians on that, and this had been taking place throughout the year. The third reason has to do also with the increase of the settlement movement. There has been a huge increase in settlers. As I said earlier, when this government took place, there were probably around 700 or so thousand settlers. They were trying to increase that, 750. They're trying to increase that to 1 million within the next few years. And of course, to do that, that meant they had to go to Palestinian areas, harass them, and do all kinds of shenanigans, including arresting many Palestinians under administrative detention, and make their life basically miserable and unlivable. And a fourth one, which has been taking place now for 16 years, now we're going 17th years, which is the siege, the crippling siege on Gaza. And they tried, the people in Gaza, and of course Hamas took over power in 2007. And throughout, from 2007 until today, they tried everything. They tried to get a political deal. They tried to do a peaceful protest. They tried to appeal to different nations, and none of that worked. That siege has been devastating to the people living in Gaza, and they had to change something in order to get that. All kinds of promises were given to them, an airport, a seaport, and so on and so on. None of that happened. And of course, let me point out that the siege is not only on one side, it's really on all sides, because Israel has been dictating to Egypt, because of the presence and pressure of the United States, also to be part of that crippling siege. And the fifth reason is the prisoners, because there are about 5,500 prisoners. That's prior to October 7th, out of which about 1,860 were under administrative detention. They've never been charged with anything, and they just hold them, detain them, prison them in miserable situations, and they could be staying there for months and years sometimes without any relief. Many of them, or a lot of them, were also children and women, and we saw that many of them got out after that in the relief in which there were exchange of prisoners. So for these 5 reasons, obviously, there had to be change. And what happened on October the 7th is that this was massive, really very surprising and professional attack on Israeli installations, in which the Israelis have never been surprised with such brilliant operation, in which they were able to get and end it really within few hours, in which they went to the original operation targeted military bases, particularly the base where Gaza was being ruled from. This is an intelligence and military installation in which all operations that had to do with Gaza, with the control of Gaza, was run from. And they were able to take it over with ease, and they were able to take many of them also as prisoners and take them back to Gaza. And because it was very easy for them, I think it was, at least 11 military bases and different settlements. Certainly a lot of people got in, and that's when some of the things may have taken place that were not planned, such as taking some of the prisoners that they were not military prisoners. At any rate, by the end of the day, you had a situation in which there was a brilliant military operation by all accounts, those who are experts, in which there was a total defeat of the Israeli intelligence and failure, as well as the military that was taking that was directing or ruling Gaza. And by the next day, the Israelis, of course, started their massive retaliation, and they put about 3 or 4 objectives. I think there was some declared objectives, and there were some hidden one. The hidden one, which was not really very hidden because it was announced and declared with different people, and I think the court, the South African, were able to present this in court, in the International Court of Justice, in which the overall or the overarching objective was to try to do what was left from the 1948 Nakba, which is try to remove as many Palestinians, the transfer or the expulsion from Gaza as possible. They were able to convince the Americans at the beginning that this could be done very quickly. And for them to do that, they had to engage into a massive campaign of destruction and killing. And it's really indiscriminate. So we saw within few days and the ensuing weeks, now we're almost 105 days into this campaign. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been targeted, killed. There isn't really any military objective to do this, except number one is to try to force the Palestinians into this, to remove them from Palestine, which is illegal, obviously by international law. And to do that, you need to inflict massive destruction and massive killings. So up today, we have over 30,000 between the killed and missing. We have over 60,000, approaching 65,000 of injured. Over 360,000 houses have been destroyed, over half completely and the others partially. They targeted the hospitals, clinics, mosques, churches, bakeries, shops, universities, schools, anything that has to do public buildings, parks, streets, anything that would have left the Palestinians with, which is already under siege and very difficult, to make it unlivable for people to stay in Gaza and try to force them. And even they would tell them, leave the north, go to the south. And while they're going to the south, they will be bombed and killed. People were bombed time and again. You know, whole families have been erased from the public registry, from the civil registry. So I don't have to go and enumerate, but it's just to show the type of bombing that is unprecedented in modern history. I mean, people talk about Dresden during the World War II operation of the Allies against America, against German, but even by that standard, what we saw is even more devastating. We remember also what happened in 1982 in the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, but we would see that maybe half an hour at the end of the day in the news hour. But here we're looking at it not only day in and day out, but every single hour and every single minute of every hour, we see that devastation coming. And with that, most of these weapons were basically American made, and the U.S. has been backing the Israelis in doing this in a very, really brutal and against U.S. interest, because one of the objectives of Israel, as well as its allies in Washington and other European capitals, is that they wanted to change this image, the image of the defeated Israeli, the failure of Israel to deter that attack, which is basically the Israeli doctrine. Israel has a doctrine that they must win every battle, and they must also win decisively and quickly, and to show the other side that they could never overcome the Israel power. So what happened here is that this doctrine was totally defeated, and that lost the support and trust of the Israeli public. And they wanted to restore that image that we are as ruthless as you can imagine, and that we're going to restore this deterrent image. And they were able to convince their allies in Washington and other European capitals that they're capable of doing this, which they have failed so far. So they declared basically this objective of trying to remove the Palestinians from the territories. That failed miserably, and then the U.S. and the American administration backed from that, because they knew that this is not only unacceptable by countries in the region, but also it cannot be achieved. It cannot be easily achieved. Yet the Israelis have been trying to do that, and there are all kinds of evidence to show and to back this up. But also they declared three other objectives. One is to end the resistance, whether it's Hamas, Jihad, or other places, completely. They have failed to do that. Still, we could see that the resistance is able, or Hamas and the other groups are able to basically send rockets throughout from any part of Gaza to any part of the Zionist state. They have been fighting them tooth and nail. There have been thousands of casualties into this. And also, they are still robust. I mean, they still have their command and control center. They haven't been able to get into the leaders within that movement that are resisting them. They also declared that they will end Hamas politically, that they cannot be the rulers of Hamas. And I don't see how that is happening. Even the Americans are walking back this. Now they are saying that they can support or agree to some kind of an arrangement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, which has been on the sideline because it's been a collaborator of the Israelis and has really played no real role at all in terms of protecting the Palestinian people or playing a role by which it has any kind of support by the people of Palestine within the West Bank and Gaza, which really has weakened it tremendously since October the 7th. And the third one was to free the so-called hostages or the prisoners that they were taken from around Gaza on October the 7th. There was a lull in which over 100 were released, but today the remaining were about 140. No one knows really how many of them survived the Israeli bombing. I suspect few dozens remain. And they haven't been able to release a single one of them. So all the declared objectives have been unfulfilled. Meanwhile, we saw this tremendous support throughout the world. I think what happened since October the 7th is that the world has awakened to the root of the problem in Palestine, that we are seeing a lot of people, particularly at the grassroots level, as well as the activists and the intellectuals in universities and other places, waking up to the reality of what Israel represents, which is a movement that is willing to use whatever methods to achieve its objectives, including genocide, war crimes against humanity, where a brutal movement has been controlling, as David says, many of these societies without knowing how much damage it has been doing to the image of these countries. So this is an important result, which I think will have significant consequences in the future. Right now, most of the political ruling elites are in the camp of the Zionists. And it will take time to change these political elites. But I think right now the image and reputation of the Zionist and the Zionist state, as well as the Zionist worldwide, have been taking a huge hit, unprecedented in the history of that struggle. Another thing that is very important to note is this conflict also has shown how much American, particularly and generally speaking, Western influence is within the Arab and Muslim countries. The OIC and the Arab League met on November the 11th, 57 countries, and they were not able to reach any single decision that could actually impact the war, which tells you a lot about who is in charge of this part of the world. They took few weak positions, saying that they wanted to stop this war, to stop this genocidal war. But these countries have spent almost $1 trillion in the past 10 years on defense. They have about 5,500 planes, perhaps 22,000 tanks, and thousands and tens of thousands of other artilleries, almost over 5 million soldiers. Yet they haven't been able to enter a single bottle of water to the Palestinians, who have been, by the way, part of that policy is starvation. The water has been cut off. Electricity has been cut off, fuel has been cut off, food has been cut off, medicine has been cut off. And they were not able to enter one without Israel saying so. So that shows the impotence and the paralysis and the weakness and the fragmentation of the Arab and Muslim countries, which I think will have also greater consequences going forward, because many people now, they saw that many of that support is just empty rhetoric. Meanwhile, they saw how, what Israel is doing and how the U.S. can go from capital to capital, the Secretary of State dictating to these people that they shouldn't widen the war, they shouldn't get involved. Of course, with the exception of what is called the resistance axis. The resistance axis is a term, really, it's an art term. It doesn't exist in reality in terms, there isn't really a treaty per se, but they have the same goal, which is to check Israel's power and not to allow it to dictate and be in control. And certainly this operation, when it started on October 7th, was not something that the whole members of that axis agreed on, but certainly they support each other. But when the Palestinians did it, the expectation from the Palestinians was that everybody would get involved. And of course, the different members of this axis had different calculations and different challenges. And roughly speaking, this is an axis or a number of powers and one country in which they have, as I said, the same goal of checking Israel power and fighting Israeli hegemony and control, as well as the U.S. dictate on the region. It is principally Iran with support from Hezbollah in Lebanon and other militias and groups in Iraq and Syria, as well as the Houthis, or the controlling government, the group that controlled the government in Yemen. And to them, they had really two objectives, and that was basically explained by the General Secretary of Hezbollah in Lebanon when he spoke almost a month after this conflict started, in which he said, or a few weeks, he said that we have two objectives here. One is to prevent the genocide and the killing that's taking place. But that objective, we have almost a lot of countries and people around the world who support this. So it's not just it's not the burden of us as members of the resistance axis to do that. So we will do our part, and to do our part, that means that we're going to engage them and try to draw as many as possible in the north. So it's going to be a controlled conflict. We're going to have change the rules of engagement. We're going to engage them within the few kilometers at the border. We'll try to bleed them, but also to draw about 1/3 of their army and keep them busy in the north in order to put less pressure on Gaza and to try to pressure them in the north. But we're not going to widen the war because that's not in the interest, obviously, of the people of Lebanon, or in the generally speaking. We don't want the focus on Gaza also to be lost, because if we see what's happening in Gaza, and if we have he didn't say that, but that's my analysis. If that happens, then we are going to see what happens in Gaza all over Lebanon, Beirut, Tripoli, Sur, Sidon, Baalbek, everywhere else. So he didn't want to do that, which will also be problematic for Lebanon. We saw also other groups, particularly in Iraq, hitting American bases, trying to put more pressure on the Americans, knowing that the only way to stop this war is to pressure the Americans, who the only country has leverage over the Israelis. And also we saw what the Houthis are doing. They said, okay, we control Bab el-Mandab. This is a very important waterway. So we are going to prevent any ships or these large containers going into Israel or to Eilat or to Israeli ports until the war ends. The other thing that Hezbollah says, which they have been doing, by the way, and it's threatening what's happening, when they were hit back by Americans. So now it's tit for tat. But also what he says, that the other objective, which is to devastate or end the resistance in Gaza, he said only a few people share that goal, that we don't want to see the resistance ending in Gaza. And he said this would be our red line. So we have to wait and see if this is going to be backed up. I think people understood that then if the axis of the resistance axis would not agree for Israel to devastate the resistance, or the Hamas jihad or others, that means they will have to engage widely. And of course, they have been engaged, but not as a full-fledged war. So this is where we are. Now let me conclude that the objectives that the Israelis declared have failed. The U.S. has taken a huge hit in reputation and a huge setback also in its objectives across the Middle East, trying to control this war. It has two contradicting objectives. It wants Israel to win this war, and also wants it to win it without having to lose the reputation that it has in terms of killing the Palestinians. And it can't do that. The Israelis cannot win that without obviously inflicting, they're trying to pressure the Palestinians by killing as many Palestinians so they can give up. That's not going to happen. So now it's trying to shut down this war, but it doesn't want Israel to be defeated. So on one hand, it wants to shut down this war. If it does it, then Israel has been defeated. The resistance is won. But if Israel is going to continue to devastate the resistance, that means there will be more, and then there would be that war would have to continue. So they climb the tree. They don't know how to come down, in essence. There are three possible, of course, in terms of the military scenarios and the political scenarios, and that's where I'm going to end. On the military scenarios, I think the Israelis have started to withdraw. They left the north after they cleared it from Palestinians. Now we saw in the past couple of days hundreds of thousands of Palestinians coming back. So obviously, when that happens, then Israelis have not been able to fulfill any of their objectives, and now we could still see that there are rockets even being sent from the north and from across. So if they are going to end the resistance, that means they have to start this campaign again, which is unlikely. The other thing is, of course, the resistance is not going to win. They're going to win by not losing. So the most likely outcome is going to be a stalemate, by which there will be some kind of a political settlement in terms of the withdrawal. But the problem here is that the Israelis, at least the prime minister, if he does that, if he reaches some kind of a political settlement, he can declare victory by killing all these thousands of Palestinians, which is really shameful. But if he does that, then the most likely outcome is going to be that he had to resign and have new elections, and he's going to go to prison. So there is a personal interest here of having this war dragged on. And of course, his coalition depends on these right-wing fascists, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So this is where the problem is, and that's what the Americans are trying to do. The Americans are trying to shut this war. They support Israel, but they hate Netanyahu, and of course, that's another problem. But in terms of the political outcomes, we have three possibilities. One that the Americans have been pushing, which is to have a two-state solution. The problem here is that train has left the station, that boat has sailed. There is no way that you can have a two-state solution, a viable two-state solution. Today, we have almost 750 to 800,000 settlers. There is no way they can uproot these settlers. There is no appetite, and there is no deal actually to be had. Every expert would tell you that two-state solution is done. So the Americans tried to push it, tried to make it as if that there is some kind of a deal. There isn't. The Israelis will do everything in their power to make sure this doesn't happen. So they're going to go through this for the next couple of years until people realize that nothing is going to happen. Meanwhile, we're seeing the demographic problem, which is the essence of the Zionist dilemma, is that there are more Palestinians today in historical Palestine than there are Jews. So people will recognize very quickly that situation, and there will be a lot of push worldwide for a one-state solution, by which there will be the same rights of Palestinians and Jews. That would be anathema to the Zionist movement, which, as David pointed out, it's a settler, colonialist, supremacist movement that it's at essence trying to uproot the Palestinians and replace them. So they're going to fight this tooth and nail as well. So we're not going to be able to get one, because there isn't a single party in Israel that would support this. So that will take also perhaps a few years, and people recognize that what we have here is an apartheid, Israeli style. It's even worse than apartheid South Africa. And that's where we were on October the 6th. That's where we will be in a few years, in which the only solution to this problem would be to de-Zionize Palestine, would be to dismantle this structure, this paradigm called Zionism. And that would be in my view, that would be the struggle. And right now, this is my last word, that Palestine has become the symbol, the compass, the scale, the direction, not only of Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims throughout the world. I don't think there is a single issue today in the world by which it can unite all the people of the world towards this. And I think that is one of the greatest outcome of what happened in the past few years, that people now recognize that Palestine is the issue, is the central issue in the world by which the forces of hegemony, control, exploitation, imperialism against all other forces. And I think eventually it's going to become this symbol by which when Zionism is dismantled, we're going to have a more peaceful and a more equitable world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami and Dr. Miller. I think we will open the floor up for questions from our live audience online. But before we begin, I'd like to give Dr. Miller a chance to dive deeper into one aspect of his comments, which was regarding the global network of Zionism, and especially the network that prevails in Muslim majority countries. Usually there is, Muslim majority countries seem to be on different levels of, on a spectrum of sovereignty, right? So there's some countries that act or seem to act with a lot more independent capabilities, and then others which are kind of tied in and dependent on powers, great powers outside of the region. Is there any correlation between sovereign action and Zionist penetration within these societies, or are these unrelated kind of ways of judging how susceptible a society might be to Zionist propaganda and lobbying, etc.?
Well, I mean, I think there's a variety. Thanks for the question. I think there's a variety of answers to that question. I mean, on the one hand, you have countries which are very much into, or have been very much into the normalization game. Obviously, the Saudis and the Emiratis are preeminent amongst them, Bahrain to some extent, Egypt under Sisi to some extent, but the Saudis and the Emiratis, and of course the Saudis and the Emiratis' own national lobbies have collaborated very closely with the Zionists, such that, for example, the Emiratis have worked with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in the US, a DC think tank, which is essentially a Likudnik overseas office, and the Emiratis have funded that. So there's strong connections there in practical senses. But of course, that element is one element of it, and the way in which the Zionists penetrate different countries operates in different ways, and also in multiple ways. So, for example, we did a show on Palestine Declassified, our weekly show on Azerbaijan and Armenia, where we showed that there's a Zionist organization organizing settlements along the northern border of Iran in Azerbaijan, an organization called ORT, which is a world organization, which is his headquarters are in London, but which nevertheless is engaged in activities in Azerbaijan. So there are economic elements to this. Often there are also political and political economic relationships. So, for example, in the UK, there's a thing called the UK-Israel roadmap, whereby people who are in many cases former Israeli intelligence operatives are working inside the British Embassy in Tel Aviv to push forward economic collaboration between the UK and Israel. So there are all sorts of ways in which that penetration happens. Of course, happens through civil society type organizations, like, for example, the religious organization Chabad, which I mentioned before, and very many others. Obviously, the Abraham Accords was a key element of that process, but what we've also seen in the kind of sort of difficult geopolitics of this is that to some extent has gone into abeyance. It's not that the Saudis have given up this, but of course the Saudis were brokered into a deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran by China. The Saudis have also decided to abandon the dollar by and large for oil trade. And those two things are themselves signs of the decline of US power. Now, so part of the reason why many of these states, especially Arab states and Muslim states, are deferential towards Israel is not necessarily to do with Zionist penetration, although that is a specific thing, but also to do with the fact of US power and the deferential nature of these countries towards US power. But once that power declines, then of course those countries will start to see sometimes that they do not have to be bound by that power, no matter how venal their leaders may be. And of course, Saudi Arabia is a classic example of the illegitimacy of a state in the Gulf region. So there's a variety of answers to that question. But what I would also say is that this maps onto elements of the distinction between those countries and movements which have seen themselves as being part of what Sami referred to as the resistance axis, and those countries which do not see themselves as being part of that. And so, of course, we have Hezbollah in Lebanon, we have the Islamic resistance in Iraq, which, of course, is made up of something like 23 different factions, not only Shia factions, but also Sunni factions. There's, of course, the resistance in Palestine. There's the Islamic Republic of Iran itself. There's the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad. And now all of that is, as Sami said, they don't have a formal agreement or treaty to do that, but they do collaborate on a daily basis. So in 2021, for example, there was an operations room in Beirut, where people from Hezbollah and from the Palestinian factions, all the factions involved, not just the Qassam brigades and Hamas, but also PIJ and the PFLP, etc., and along with representatives from the Quds Force of the IRGC of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, so that is an indication that there's a kind of a nexus of opposition. And of course, as we move into this period, as Sami has been saying, this is the defining issue of our time. And there has been such pressure on West Asian, Arab and Muslim countries that some of them will begin to crack. I saw there was a big demonstration in Cairo, I think, just the other day, 2 days ago, where they were chanting about the shame which the South Africans' extraordinary actions at the International Court brings upon the Egyptian nation. And of course, there's also been indications, haven't there, of some Muslim states being reluctant to engage in the coalition which the Americans put together to bomb Yemen. And that's of course after we've even thought about the collapse of the Americans' coalition to protect prosperity, as it was laughably called, which collapsed after the US Navy said they hadn't got enough ships, and then after Spain, Italy, and France left the coalition, and then after the most they were able to muster as an indication of the power and the prowess of that coalition was destroying three Ansar Allah speedboats. 10 fighters died, of course. And then, of course, when they come to bomb Yemen with the UK, it was made very clear this was not part of their operation to protect prosperity, which has collapsed in and itself because the US is unable to mount the coalition, and also the US is scared, and that's why, of course, the US, in advance of the raid on Yemen, rang up Ansar Allah and said, "Guys, we're going to bomb you. So you might want to evacuate your bases," which, of course, is what happened. And that's an indication that the US is scared, and what they're scared of, as they've revealed in the New York Times, is that they know that Ansar Allah has weaponry, yes, from Iran, but also the weaponry they captured from the Saudis, which presumably is largely US made. So they know that the Ansar Allah movement, the government of Yemen, is able to sink large numbers of US ships, which are effectively floating targets in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean. And they also know, of course, as we've seen in the last couple of days, that which in the attacks which have been done by the IRGC in Pakistan just most recently, and then prior to that against Daesh in Syria, and then of course also in Iraq against the Americans, and then against Kurdish collaborators with the Zionists, and indeed against the Zionist intelligence base in Iraq. We know that the Iranians are closely monitoring this, that they have done these attacks, one as revenge for the presumably Zionist organized attack, bombing against civilians in Kerman, who were there, of course, to commemorate the US assassination of General Qasem Soleimani. And we know that the part of the purpose of these attacks is not just revenge, but also to demonstrate in a visible way that they have missiles which can reach every part of the occupied territory of Palestine. So what we're seeing here is a sort of calculus of geopolitics, which is in rapid flux and rapid change. And part of the reason for that, of course, just to finish, is because, of course, the massive failure of NATO, led, of course, by the US and the UK, to do anything constructive in Russia, and indeed to be totally routed 3 times by the Russians in Ukraine. And that's an indication, isn't it, of the inability of the US to project power anymore, and that we are entering a much more fluid period of international relations, which, of course, brings with it tremendous risks.
Thank you very much. I would like to field some questions that I'm getting from the viewers. This is a question for both Dr. Sami and Dr. Miller. So the axis of resistance has faced a number of skepticism through what has been reiterated both by analysts out of Israel and also Sunni commentators, Sunni Muslim commentators, that after the war in Syria forms a big obstacle towards clarity on the issue of Zionism and its role in Western Asia. So this, a lot of people point towards, what the civil war in Yemen and the civil war in Syria as an example of maybe the questionable intentions of those who are resisting Zionism in the region. And this is something that also Israeli propaganda also very loudly announces on every show almost. How is the example of both the civil war in Yemen and Syria relevant or irrelevant to our discussions about Palestine? Is it just a kind of a distractive kind of narrative? Because it has impact both on, public opinion abroad and also amongst Sunni Arabs. It's a linchpin in an argument to bifurcate, forces of or resources of resistance that might be put forward in support of Palestine.
Who do you want to go first?
Go ahead, David.
Okay, well, I mean, I wouldn't refer to what happened in Syria as a civil war. And there is the rub, isn't it? I mean, what happened in Syria was, to my mind, there may have been some issues of dissent internally in Syria, but this was a regime change operation led by the US and the UK, and indeed with help from France, as well as the Saudis and the UAE. And of course, let's remember also with the Zionists involved. The Zionists were involved, of course, on the side of NATO as part of the regime change operation. If you recall, one of the things which was interesting about the then Home Secretary in the UK when she went on secret off-diary visits to the Zionist entity was that she'd gone to the Golan Heights and she went to the IDF field hospital, which of course was there to patch up Nusra and other fighters to go back and fight against the Assad government. Now, the whole question about this being a Sunni question as opposed to a Shia question, that's something which is a complex question, but which nevertheless it's not straightforward that that's the case. As I mentioned before, the Iraqi resistance, Islamic resistance in Iraq is not just Shia; it's Sunni and Shia. Of course, we know that the Palestinian resistance is predominantly Sunni. Of course, there was a split within Hamas over the whole Syrian question, but let's recall there was a split within Hamas, right? So there were, in particular, those factions in Gaza and the Qassam brigades in particular, didn't have a split, didn't fall out with Assad, didn't fall out with Iran. And if you look, and you can see this on the YouTube channel of Memory, the Zionist propaganda organization, which of course is very useful for such purposes, you can see the interview with Salah Al-Aruri, who was of course assassinated by the Zionists just the other week in Beirut, talking in 2017 and in 2019 about the fact that without the Islamic Republic of Iran, whatever you think about their motives, without them, there would be no existing fighting Palestinian resistance. Now that's what the resistance in Palestine says. It's not my view on it. And I think what we have to face is that if you want to have unity in the Ummah, and you know, I talk about this from the outside, then you have to have genuine unity between the Shia, as you might put it, and Sunnis. Now, of course, that must mean that you put aside the theological and other more recently political disputes between Shia and Sunni, and you work out that the main enemy is the Zionists and their imperialist backers in the US. You cannot get into bed with the US and the UK one day and then the next day say that you're actually opposed to US imperialism or to Zionism. It's one or the other. Let's of course recall also Daesh's recent statements criticizing Hamas, which indicates what side they're on in that dispute. So I think there's a real difficulty here, of course, of the question of Yemen, but also most importantly of the question of Syria, which you know, the Syrian question is in some ways in the past, but this is a real issue which people have to overcome, I think, and to see that the predominant issue of our time is Zionism and dismantling Zionism, and we don't dismantle Zionism by taking its side in particular other conflicts. That's what my view would be.
Well, let me just say that this is probably the most important question that analysts usually have to face, and people who are engaged in the struggle have to answer. And it's not an easy thing, because it takes time to go through the different interpretations of what this is a question of facts and analysis, and people differ on the facts and differ on the analysis. So it's very difficult just to answer it on the fly. Yet, I just want to start by acknowledging that there has been massive suffering. There's a lot of feelings and emotions when it comes to this issue, particularly with respect to Syria. And therefore, I would like to separate the emotional part from the geopolitical and political analysis when it comes to this. So there is not an attempt to lessen the suffering. And I usually say that before what happened in Gaza, and obviously what happened in Gaza surpasses many other or a lot of other sufferings, but that this question is not about who suffers more. It's not a competition on who suffers more. I said in the past that I acknowledge that
Syrians, Iraqis, Afghanis, Yemenis.
This is subjective. It has to do with the nature of it. And what we face in Palestine is that is trying to keep this region, these countries.
Dr. Sami, we're not able to hear you very clearly. Is that with everybody else, or is it just me? Okay, so David is also saying he can't hear you. It seems like there's some interference. So
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. All right, I don't know where I lost you.
No, right. It was very. Since you said you wanted to separate emotions, yeah. You wanted to separate emotions, yeah.
Okay. All right. Just sure that lost. Right. What I would say is that we need to separate emotions from analysis, and that's the centrality of the Palestinian issue. It's nothing to do with how much suffering the Palestinians have versus other kinds of suffering. And I acknowledge that Syrians, Afghanis, Yemenis, Iraqis, Libyans, perhaps, and others have suffered more than the Palestinians, at least prior to October 7th. But this is not a competition on who suffered more. It's about the nation. And what we have here is a Zionist state that's to keep this these countries surrounded, fragmented, under control, rejecting, exhausted, not able to advance any field because they think any advance, any attempt really, any attempt to have a democratic system or order, that's going to be a direct challenge to them and to their hegemony. And that's why they're going to keep this region as such. And therefore, to confront this entity, to dismantle Zionism, should take precedence over any other struggle. And as it says, and pointed out,
Dr. Sami, could I ask you to hold your comment for a second, because there's a lot of interference on my end, and I just confirmed with the other panelists, we're having difficulty hearing you. Maybe you could sign out and sign back in. And in the meantime, I'd like to ask Dr. Miller another question regarding the implications of the war in Gaza for the region. One of the things that we see also is, we saw recently, part of the escalation has been what's happening, and it's quite opaque what's happening, but northern Syria and Iraq are both becoming an area of critical interest for Iran and Turkey. And it's very strange to see this area. I mean, we can understand the border of Lebanon and Israel. We can understand to a certain degree Bab al-Mandeb and the movement of the Houthis and other areas. But what is the role of the Kurds in this process? Where do they stand, especially those that are both being targeted by Iran and Turkey? How do we understand this in terms of the war in Gaza and Zionism in the region? Maybe you could give us some background. The reason I ask is because on the left, we have a bit of confusion regarding the role the Kurds play in this region. As you know, some of those who are allies on the front against Zionism are also allies or very strong advocates of Kurdish autonomy. And at the same time, Kurds seem to be close associates. Well, some factions of the Kurds seem to be close associates with Zionists and with the Americans. So how do we understand this complexity?
Well, I don't think it's that complex. I mean, of course, any comments I make must recognize the diversity of political and military forces within the various Kurdish groupings. But the Kurds, some Kurds are involved directly with the Zionists and are engaged in terrorist attacks against Iran. And the fact that they've exacted revenge against them is not a surprise. When you talked about the Americans, yeah, I mean, Rojava and the YPG, coming out, of course, of the communist organization around Öcalan, is essentially cat's paw for the CIA. We have many people in this country, in the UK, supporting the YPG as being some kind of leftist revolutionary paradise. But look, this is a CIA operation, and there's no other way of saying this. And so that's we find, unsurprisingly, and I see this in the British left all the time, is that we have people who've gone to fight with the YPG from the UK, who then ended up fighting the Russians in Ukraine and ended up, before they were killed just recently, actually being part of Nazi battalions. And I think that is the end of the possibility of thinking about these people as progressives. That they were effectively fighting with Nazi battalions for NATO's interests, and that's in the end what is happening in part of what's called Kurdistan, and part of the involvement of some Kurdish factions in collaborating with the US in stealing Syria's oil is a black mark against those factions, and I don't think people will ever forget that. Now, it's not impossible for groups to reconsider their positions, and the prime example I would give of that in recent days has been the way in which the non-Ansarullah movement in Yemen, the ones who are allegedly the official government, who don't actually have any bases in Yemen but are based in Saudi and what people disparagingly refer to as luxury hotels. Those are people who have said, in the attack on Yemen by the US and the UK, we are on the side of Ansarullah. And that is, of course, the entirely correct position. And that we could do with a lot more of that, as Sami has been saying. Look, the preeminent enemy here is Zionism and its US and UK backers, German backers too. And Zionism is the main obstacle to peace in the region. If there are theological differences between Sunni and Shia, and there are political differences which have been, to be frank, have been whipped up and exacerbated deliberately by the Saudis and by the UAE and other such places, and indeed by some other factions. Well, those are difficulties which should be addressed, of course, but which are a subsidiary to the question of dismantling Zionism. And so when you see some imams and sheikhs in Saudi talking about the need to leave Gaza alone, and it's wrong in Sunni theology, I know it's a particular strand of Sunni theology, it's wrong to go against the rulers. Well, this is a purely politically constructed alleged theological dispute, which is there to defend the interests of the Saudis, and indeed, not indirectly but directly defend the interests of the Zionists. As Dr. Sami has been saying, the main enemy is the Zionists, and once we dismantle Zionism, there will be all sorts of prospects for peace in West Asia, including, of course, the dismantling of US bases in Syria and in Iraq. Can we imagine what would happen if that was the case, that the Americans were chucked out of Iraq again permanently and out of Syria? Well, then we would have a very different set of questions to answer.
Just to add on that, Dr. Sami, as you jump in to add, also I invite you to conclude your remarks on the previous discussion as well. But just to add in there, we always hear about Iranian-backed or Iranian proxies in the region. However, we don't hear too much in the coverage about U.S. proxies, even though, or Israeli proxies, even though I think that with the new generation of warfare, paramilitary and proxy warfare is being practiced on both sides. And this leaves basically, what Dr. Sami referred to as the axis of resistance sticking out as a sore thumb, both, on the map as we imagine the conflict, and it keeps the forces of Zionism covered, unable for us to understand very clearly where things lie. And so, Dr. Sami, as you make your comments, maybe you can also kind of touch on this lack of clarity that exists amongst not particularly analysts, but those who are, sitting by and want to do something more constructive for Palestine.
Thank you, and I apologize for this problem with the internet. Well, you have basically three questions. I'll try to lump them all together. I started the previous answer about that I would never lessen the suffering of people, and their genuine attempt to have a non-tyrannical government or try to have more democratic governance. But what I was saying is that these things are not unrelated. What happened is that the enemy of the people here, and these are primarily the Zionist state and their backers, will try to exploit the fault lines that exist. And of course, part of that fault line is the different ethnic and religious and sectarian differences, and try to use to weaken the Ummah further and to weaken the countries in the region further. And that has been exploited. And we've seen what happened during the so-called Arab Spring between 2011 and beyond. I would never lessen these. Well, we have to look at the geopolitical map in this thing. And we have to realize also, in the same context that there are Kurdish legitimate grievances, but also they have been exploited by Israel, by the United States, by foreign powers in order to deepen the problems within the region, because in Israel's geopolitical view, Israel wants to be an ally of all the different minorities, the Maronites in Lebanon, the Kurds, because they think they can also create what they call a barrier states, states where they could actually become partners in trying to make sure that this region would always stay under control, under hegemony. And this, by the way, these are not hidden plans. I mean, these plans started in the 1950s about South Sudan, about the Kurdish state, about the Maronite state. There was also a more elaborate plan that was written in 1982 by someone called Oded Yunan, that you can find also on the internet. It was first in Hebrew. It was translated by Professor Israel Shahak, which I saw a version of it back in 1983 through an address by Ariel Sharon, who was defense minister, had to resign, then became prime minister, in which they try actually to have the Middle East into 43 countries, because that's the more countries, the more divided along ethnic, religious, sectarian lines, the better it is for them to have them under control and keep them weak and fragmented. So this is not a hidden agenda. It's not a hidden agenda that Israel played a huge role in the separation of Sudan and South Sudan. When the president of South Sudan made his first visit after independence to Israel, next to him was a person at the airport. And when he was received by the president of Israel, he said, if I'm going to give anybody credit for our independence, it would be to this man. This man was the head of the state, that was the station chief of Mossad in Juba, South Sudan capital, for many, many years. So this is what they've been trying to do. They're trying to exploit all these things. So, I mean, David referred to Israel, to the Syria, and how they were trying to exploit that. That's not hidden anymore. We've seen many testimonies of what happened. So it's very tragic what happened. But at the same time, we need to realize that the enemy, in this case, the Zionist enemy that is trying to control this region. And I made some remarks in my speech, how they were able to prevent 57 countries from actually sending a single bottle of water before them, saying so. So if you had any doubts about who's in control of this region, there should be no doubt now. Now you have other forces who are unwilling to succumb to this, to be subjected to this, to agree to this, right? And that happened, with Iran. Whether you agree with Iranian policy or not, you have to acknowledge the fact that they have been at the forefront of trying to fight off this foreign influence. They are the only ones who have been supporting Palestinian resistance. I'm not talking about, giving them aid like some countries do, or supporting them rhetorically in the United Nations or other forums. These are forces, and I've been being very frank, and I know this sometimes make people cringe, that they have been supporting them in weapons, in direct finance, in political arenas, and which made them able to actually go and challenge the Zionist power in Palestine. And not only that, but they have also built up Hezbollah, which is a formidable force in terms of what happened in the past. I mean, people really have to go and read history. What was the relationship between Lebanon and Israel for many decades? Today, for any attack on Lebanon, there is a counterattack. That was never the case in the 70s and 80s. That came because of that resistance. So I think we need to look at this, at the hard facts, how this is about. Of course, people would like to take this. They're not going to challenge you on the facts, but then they're going to challenge you on analysis, that there is an Iranian project, that there is a grand Iranian project to make this area basically a Shia crescent, or there is a conspiracy and this and that. I'm not going to go into these things because people would differ on analysis. What's important today is that we do have a real confrontation. People are dying. People are standing up to the hegemony of Israel and the United States, and people need to step up. You know, if they don't like it, then they can step up on their own. And that means for us to understand what's happening today, our goal, immediate goal, let's focus on that. This is not about Sunni Shia issue. They would like us to drag us into this hole. This is not about this now. Our immediate goal is to stop the carnage, is to stop the mayhem, is to stop the killing, is to stop the massacres taking place in Palestine. Now, who's doing anything militarily to stop that? I know there's a lot of movement from many Muslim countries, diplomatically, politically, all kinds of things, but there hasn't been a single act that can actually be applied that we can call pressure. I mean, Sunni countries, other countries, they can actually.
But on that, excuse me, Dr. Sami, just while you say that, the problem that I see in confronting that issue is that most Muslims who there's some groups who want to say something like, well, if Hezbollah doesn't do something, if the Houthis don't do something, if Hamas doesn't escalate the situation, then things will go back to normal, you know? And it's actually, you know, Iran is the destabilizing force here. If they just keep quiet, you know, then we won't have an escalation and we can just go back to business as usual. So
what business as usual is. Business as usual is where Palestinians would be under occupation forever. Business as usual would be where the Aqsa Mosque would be taken over a bit by bit, piece by piece over time. Business as usual would have been that they are settling Israeli settlers who are coming from all over the world, extremists who are taking Palestinian land day in and day out. Business as usual would be these countries basically preventing any kind of real change. We've seen what the Arab Spring movement was about. Who was the force behind the scene that makes sure that this would never see the light of day? I was in Washington for much of that era. I saw what the Zionist lobby was doing, going to during the Obama administration to make sure that these attempts by different Arab people in the region trying to get any kind of representation, real representation, how it was thwarted. Israel played a huge role, along with other Arab regimes, I acknowledge, these counter-revolutionary forces. So what I was saying is that Israel is going to make sure that these people, these countries would never be advanced in any field, not scientifically. They kill. If people are great in certain fields, look at the assassination attempts. There is a book that came a few years back, I think 2018 it was, called Rise and Kill First. I counted over 800 assassinations. It weren't just Palestinians. It was Palestinians, Moroccans, Iraqis, Iranians, you name them, the Egyptians, those people who were trying to do something that they thought these were threatening to them. So anybody who comes with with any kind of new technology, and if they think this is a threat to them, what do? They go and eliminate them. So the point here is that this is not something that can be overcome. This is business as usual. Is if you agree that Zionism would carry the day, that they would be the hegemon of the region, and you are willing to live under that, which a lot of Arab regimes are willing to do that, then this is business as usual. If you're going to reject this notion that you're not going to agree that Israel has the legitimacy to be the hegemon of the region, it has the legitimacy to dictate where the borders are or who's going to do what, and that the Palestinians would have to live under this whether they like it or not, then you are a resistance within the resistance axis. You are someone who rejects this. Then you have to bear the consequences. Now, there are countries who know better. They know that these things are unacceptable, but they're not willing to pay the price. So they compromise and they try to look the other way, and they try to play the game of two-state and this and that. Let's define what Zionist is. A Zionist or Zionism, a Zionist is any person who believes, acknowledges, or agrees that there should be a sovereign Jewish state or entity in Palestine, even on 1 inch. That's what Zionist is. So if you agree on a two-state solution, then you are 78% Zionist. Now, if you agree to be a Zionist, then you have to take the whole package. You don't get part of the package. And the whole package is a supremacist state, a settler colonial state. In its doctrine, it has to expand all the time and be the hegemon all the time. That's what it is. If people didn't know about it decades ago, it's very clear what it is today. There will be people in the region, in the area, who would reject this, and they're not willing to live with this. These are called the rejectionists. These are called the resistance axis. So this is where we are today. Part of that resistance axis today are the Palestinian resistance movements, are some other movements in the region. Iran declares to that. By the way, Iran is not guaranteed. That today, the people in charge in Iran, in that, if there is a change in the regime, that's why they keep, trying to have regime change. That could change. Let's imagine for a moment a world where there is this regime in Iran disappears. What's going to happen to Hezbollah? It will be weakened. What happens to the Palestinian resistance movement? They will be weakened. Who else is resisting? Now, all the rhetoric, all the things that are being said by Islamic movements, nationalist movements, leftist movements, whatever, they don't threaten Israel. Okay, they say a lot of great speeches. They don't care about that. So we have to face realities. People have to look at the real things on the ground rather than trying to imagine things that they don't exist. Again, I don't listen.
Can I, for the sake of time, Dr. Sami, can I have you speak about the position of the Kurds?
Yes,
I apologize for intervening, but
no problem. Third, as I said, Kurds have legitimate grievances, but we have also to look at the geopolitical situation and the balance of power situation. And Israel has been trying to exploit this issue by trying to present themselves as friends of Kurds and Kurdish independence. And there has been, and this is not even disputed, it's not controversial, that they are very close to many Kurdish forces. The US is trying to do the same for Turkey. Remember, part of the doctrine of the imperative of US is not to allow any country in any particular region to become more powerful, where it would challenge US supremacy and US interests. And because Turkey has been trying to do that for the past 15, 20 years, they created this region in northern Syria. They created bases, and they armed and they trained about 50,000 Kurds. They spent almost $5 billion. They gave them the oil fields in order to become more independent and more economically viable. That has nothing to do with Daesh, has nothing to do with ISIS. All that was created to make sure that Turkey would come back 180 degrees, trying to preserve its national unity, because 20% of the population are Kurdish. And if you have that kind of a PKK-related power on the border of Turkey, that's going to destabilize Turkey. That's what the foes, that's what the enemies are doing. And people who don't realize that, then they don't understand anything about how the world is being run. And that is of great danger. The Kurds are being used, their grievances are being used so that they can destabilize and divide and fragment this part of the world. Now, what the Kurds need to do, we have to realize that, again, they have grievances, but the solution is not with separatism. The solution is not with uniting with the enemy that trying to exploit these divisions in order to advance their own objectives. So I think what happened in Iraq is that the people of Iraq have given them the ultimate. They have basically an autonomous region. There's absolutely zero need for them to ally themselves with Israel. Having a separate Kurdish state is going to destabilize the region. And I think what we have to do, this region needs to move more towards unity and federalism rather than separatism and division. And that's what I would tell them. And the same thing, I think, also, if you look at the last 20 years in Turkey, the grievances and the legitimate demands of the Kurds are going in the right direction, in terms of identity, in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of many things, as you see. And we need to go through that route. rather than encouraging separatism and division as the Israelis and the Zionists and the Americans and others around the world are trying to push, because they want to see this part of the world weakened and divided and under their hegemony and control. Thank you.
We're coming up against our closing time, so I want to ask a quick question. Then I will allow Dr. Sami and Dr. Miller to have, if they have any questions or comments they want to add as we conclude. Dr. Miller, I don't know if you've been following, but recently in the UK there has been a kind of a growth of declarations about terrorist groups in the UK. One prominent terrorist group, one group that was declared as or will be declared, I don't know if it's officially happened or not, is Hizb ut-Tahrir. I had a question. Is there any relation between what's happening in Gaza and Zionism and this recent declaration, or has this been in the pipeline for a very long time? Do you have any news about that?
Sure. So it's been in the pipeline in the sense that the government tried to do it on two separate occasions previously and failed to do it because, of course, Hizb ut-Tahrir is nothing to do with political violence and terrorism. It's a complete joke empirically. But of course, what they're doing is you ask, is it connected to Gaza? Well, obviously and transparently, this is connected to Gaza. So it's part of the process of trying to destroy any criticism of Zionism and to suppress all pro-Palestine commentary in the UK. It's one of a number of measures they've taken. They are now doing things like arresting people for having effigies of babies on marches for hate crimes, as if this is some kind of blood libel against the Jews. They're trying to arrest people and stop people from using the slogan "from the river to the sea" as if it's allegedly genocidal. They're trying to stop people from flying Palestinian flags. There's an all-out attempt by the state to clamp down on any discussion of Palestine and any criticism of Zionism. And indeed, of course, what the Zionists want is to simply eliminate any concept that there is such a thing as Palestine or that there are such a thing as Palestinians. And the British state is a core part of that work. Is very closely aligned with Israel on those matters. And so it's the latest in a series of issues. They also tried to clamp down, of course, on the Iranian government and its activities in the UK, as have the US. Press TV, which I produce a show for, is of course banned in the UK. Truly extraordinary state of affairs. So it's an attempt to clamp down, right down on any demonstration of support for Palestine or criticism of Zionism. And I would give one final example. Just the other day, several people have been arrested for the second time from a communist party, the CPG-BML in the UK, for having a leaflet which is critical of Zionism. And this is an attempt simply to destroy the movement of support for the Palestinians, which has grown massively since October the 7th.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sami?
I mean, this is one of the tools that the US and Britain and other forces trying to pull whenever they want to silence somebody, is just to give them that label. I mean, it's unbelievable, the double standard, the hypocrisy that these governments and these people, they have been touting, going all over the world, talking about democracy, the rule of law, dissent, the right of dissent. They go and demonstrate when someone burns the Quran or burns or have cartoons against the Prophet, they have all these liberal values, but when it comes to the other side, what do? They go and label you and try to silence you. What happened since October the 7th, we've seen in the US and Britain and other places, where they fire people for tweet, they fire people for expressing an opinion, they try to outlaw student groups for talking about the issue because they can't confront the facts. I mean, they know they are defeated on the merits. When you try to have a legitimate argument or a debate on the issue, they can't answer. How can they? When you're talking about a settler, colonialist, supremacist, racist movement that is doing all these things, when you have a genocide taking place before your own eyes, you see babies being killed, I mean, they're being chased down. Families, whole families are being targeted. And what are they going to say? So what they do is just shut you up, shut you down, try to make sure that you don't even say, and try to delegitimize you, marginalize you. And what do? They do all these kind of things. They use the tactics. The FBI goes and knocks on the door, try to put the fear of God in you, and they try to threaten you. They try to silence you. They try to charge you, sometimes entrap you. All these things will see so-called global war on terror. So why are we surprised? So what do? You fight back. You fight back big, and you try to see. And I think this time around we have many allies. When this global war on terror was against Muslims, other people were doubting. We don't know these people well enough to defend them. But now they could see, before their own eyes, how many people now have seen the truth. They said, we have been living in a lie. These people have been lying to us. These governments have been lying to us. These pundits have been lying to us. These experts have been lying to us, and they lost. And I think this is a great defeat, because what they did, they undermined their own system. I mean, this is a US-built order. They have been working very hard at it since at least World War II. And it's being crumbling before their own eyes. People no longer believe governments. People no longer believe that these people really care about them and care about their welfare and care about the truth and care about justice. All these slogans that they have been using for decades. They use it against the Iraq war. It was based on a lie. They use it against Afghanistan, other places. They use it before against Vietnam, and so on and so forth. Now they could see that they have lied to. It's very interesting now how they're going to come out of that hole, because all the things about liberal values now is been undermined. And I think we are, depending on how this is going to turn out, I think we could be edging towards a new world order in which China is going to play a prominent role, and I think other countries. The problem here, of course, before us is that there is still a lot of struggle that has to take place, not only against the Zionist idea and Zionist ideology and Zionist institutions, as David started his talk with. These are thousands and thousands of very, very powerful institutions around the world, but also all those who back them either in public or hidden. These Muslim countries today, so-called Muslim countries, I mean, we could see, I'm going to end with this example. When they were meeting, while Palestinians being massacred, there were very, very, how should I say, mild suggestions. And who stood against them? Like, we can threaten the supply of oil, or at least do this or that, or not even a threat to the supply, maybe reduce how much oil you do this. Very, small things. Or we cannot allow them to use airspace to bomb this or bomb that. The countries that stood in this were mostly Muslim countries who are allied with the US. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, Jordan, Mauritania, Morocco, all the normalizers. So we still have a long way to go. These people make policies and institute policies and follow policies that directly contradict what their peoples are. So this is a struggle that's going to take place, I think, in a larger context within the region. But I think eventually truth and justice will prevail.
Thank you very much.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Oh, wait. Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So we've come to the conclusion of our webinar. Before we close, I wanted to give Dr. Miller a chance to say a few words if he wants to. If not, we will go ahead and conclude. Dr. Miller, is there anything you would like to add?
Well, I would just say one thing, which is that that we are in a fast-moving geopolitical space, and US power is ebbing away by the day. And of course, we face the risk of a regional conflagration, and that inevitably is going to be difficult for many, many people. But we also face the possibility of a significant advance for the Palestinian resistance, and indeed the possibility, which was visible to many, many people on the 7th of October, of the actual end of the Zionist entity. And of course, that must be the main foreign policy and foreign affairs aim of all people of good faith in the world today, it seems to me.
Thank you very much. This will conclude our webinar, the 65th webinar. I would like to thank a lot of the people that have made this possible, especially the very, very hardworking and sincere translators, Mrs. Danica Saab and Mr. Omar Kahwaji, for their very professional and superior service in translating and getting this message out to other audiences. I would also like to thank Taimur Tanvir and also our own associate, Mrs. Jamila Jengiz. So for all of those who made this possible, thank you very much. For all of those who are following us online live, we will be having another webinar in the next 2 weeks. I hope you keep attuned to that flyer. Thank you very much, and assalamu alaikum from Istanbul.
Thank you.